Today, I want to talk about a truly unusual source of inspiration for me, especially in terms of being inspired for science fiction and fantasy, because it's not a world building book, it's not a work of SF or fantasy, it's a cookbook. And the book is named Eat Me, The Food and Philosophy of Kenny Shopsin. And if you're not familiar with Kenny Shopsin, he died a few years ago, a New York restaurateur. He started off running a grocery store that expanded into a little restaurant, and he was notorious for being quite garrulous and for having an extremely opinionated set of rules that he laid down. It's been said that the infamous Soup Nazi sketch was at least partly inspired by this man. But more than anything else, he was notorious for running a restaurant that had one of the most astounding menus you've ever seen in your life. I'm going to show an excerpt from it here. It goes on and on. And he was also, as you can probably guess from something this monolithic, extremely opinionated. And many of those opinions revolved around food and around people's attitudes towards food. I'm going to read a slightly expurgated example of his opinion from this book, where he's talking, it's a lead into a discussion about Mexican food. And he said, I'm addicted to the internet. Among other things, I like to see what people are saying about me, but I also like to see what people are saying about food in general. One of the sites I visit regularly is Chowhound, where food-obsessed people like to talk about what they ate last night, or where they're going to eat, or where they can go for specific food. It seems as if the majority of the entries read something like, I'm going to such and such a restaurant, what's the best thing on the menu? When I read that, I think, why would you care what the best thing on the menu is? He doesn't say care, but you can figure it out. Maybe you don't like the best thing on the menu. Maybe the so-called best thing is deep-fried yak brains, and maybe, just maybe, deep-fried yak brains don't appeal to you. Why don't you just order what sounds good to you? Well, I already know the answer. It's because people are afraid of being mediocre or being ordinary. It wasn't that way 20 years ago or 30 years ago. It was easier to be satisfied. People didn't have cell phones. There were no flat-screen televisions. They didn't feel the need to indulge in every 18-course dinners that some jerk restaurant reviewer described as orgasmic. They didn't have any of the media hype we have now that is supposed to make us happy or even contenders for happiness. People were more content with their ordinary lives and with their mediocre desires. Even today's most people's tastes, when it pertains to food or art or drama or sex, if they're really honest with themselves, it's just not that highly evolved. The difference is that people are not happy with that simplicity. When it comes to food, which is the only subject I know anything about, they reach higher than they have the palate to appreciate. Sometimes they reach so high in terms of what they order or go to cook at home that I'm not sure they even know what they're eating, much less like it. And they definitely reach higher than anything they could achieve in terms of their own cooking skills. No wonder they're daunted by cooking. They have no idea what the F they're eating. How can they expect to know how to make it? I have a lot of character defects, but reaching above myself in terms of my own desires is not one of them. I don't pretend to like things or try to like them because someone told me or because I think I should like them. I have no problem with my lack of sophistication when it comes to anything, and certainly when it comes to food. It is not necessary to tickle my palate with subtle nuances and exotic hidden ingredients. With food, I don't like subtlety. What I like is gusto. I think that's why I like Mexican food so much. You take a bite of good Mexican food and it just explodes all over your mouth. Now, one of the things that comes to me immediately from reading all this is the voice. That on every page of this book, even when he's just running down the ingredients list for a particular recipe, and the book has according to the title, more than 100 recipes, even when he's just running through the ingredients list for a recipe or describing some of the ins and outs of preparing these different things, the voice always comes through, this very specific, very irascible voice. And I love when people who are talking about a subject that they know deeply and thoroughly and with love are able to speak of it using a voice like that. Now, when I first picked this book up, I was in the process of basically reteaching myself how to cook. I had some passing experience in the kitchen, but I really never worked on it very hard. And then one day my wife had the amazing idea of getting us a subscription to HelloFresh. This is not an ad for HelloFresh, by the way. And it worked out really well for both of us, because it got both of us experience in the kitchen, and it got me that much more curious about food generally, because I had not been as curious about food until that point. Certainly not in the way that someone who cooks would be curious about food. And when I bumped into the book, when I bumped into Eat Me, that fed, pardon the pun, directly into my growing curiosity. So here I was reading about this very opinionated person's view on these things and saying to myself, okay, I agree here, I don't agree there. I see where he's coming from. And that in itself made it a very rewarding read, to be able to have this one-sided but fascinating conversation with someone who was obviously thoroughly passionate about what he was doing. And again, he had this voice. Now, what does all this have to do with science fiction and fantasy? Well, first off, I don't want anybody to get the impression this is about a segue into Delicious in Dungeon. Although it could be, I wouldn't rule it out. What I'm really thinking about is how whenever we have somebody in a particular world where there are things that have, great technical depth to them, like magic, for instance, or, the physics of faster than light travel or what have you, you always have people who live and breathe this stuff. And not necessarily scientists, they could be people who have just made it into their way of life. Kenny Shopsin was not a food scientist. He was a short order cook who made good. He was a grocery store owner who made good. But this was his life. And he was sunk so deeply into this that he allowed it to permeate his life and vice versa. And it shows, in everything that he talks about, it comes through. So I said to myself, let's imagine, in a fantasy world where you have, say, a mage who writes a spell book that has the same kind of irascibility and this worldview and this depth and this personality. And then you could go into a science fiction world and you can have some dry technical subject in there, but expressed by way of somebody who has that kind of voice, who has that kind of vision and deep immersion. And that humanizes it. And so reading this for me was a great thought experiment. It wasn't just a great cookbook. There wasn't just a lot of stuff in there that was fun to read about and fun to think about making. But also as a way to say to myself, how would a voice like this manifest in my world, in my story, in whatever world that I'm coming up with? What would he be fascinated with? What would his life have revolved around? And that's an open exercise, and it's not something that has to be about cooking. Like I said, it could be about magic. It could be about some far future technology. It could be anything at all. The point is to humanize it. The point is to give it the voice of somebody who has lived and breathed this stuff. And for me, this book was a great example of how that kind of thing can be given a human voice. There is, by the way, no digital edition of this book, unfortunately. You can only buy it in paperback. You can only buy it in hardcover. But really, part of the reason why the book works as well as it does is because of the presentation and the layout, and that doesn't really translate well into a digital edition. So if you're remotely curious about food, if you're remotely curious about the way that he approaches food, I recommend it. And I also recommend thinking about how the way that he approaches this subject could be the way that somebody in one of your stories approaches their subject, with the same kind of deep immersion, the same kind of way of life flavor, the same irascibility, the same voice. It's worth thinking about. So until next time, I'll see you around.